Indeed, the fact that it occurred in places like Austin, Texas, and Fargo, South Dakota, is an indicator that something more was going on than simply a spontaneous response to a political controversy. The way a riot is supposedly occurs is people are mad about a particular event, feel frustrated about the futility of political solutions short of political outrage expressed in protest, and so that they then, in that local community, form a protest. But here, that did not make a lot of sense. Here, a lot of the protest actions that ended up becoming violent, riotous actions had no correlation to anything that happened in their community. Indeed, even the Minneapolis riots were in response to the George Floyd death, where there had been quick action taken dismissing the police officers involved and initiating criminal prosecutions. So there was no particular apparent political justification for these actions. That's because they meet a combination of the recipe for riots. It involves the rise of Antifa, the pushing of fake media narratives meant to build fear, frustration, and futility within the African American community, and the incorporation of the criminal class. They needed all three. They needed the BLM to be sponsoring protests that could be used to mask the riotous actions to come, to be the pretext for mass organizations of people that included Antifa and the criminal class to engage in specific violence against both people and property wherever and whenever they could. The fact that BLM so easily accommodated their request by so quickly forming these protests is indicia that they are in cahoots with some of the groups involved and are not meaningfully involved in trying to build solutions to civil rights issues. Indeed, if you go through the history, you take the broader background and context of these kind of riots, we look at the broader historical context, we can start with the role of Antifa. The role of Antifa, a loosely organized group of people that consider themselves, quote unquote, anti-fascist, derived their name from a German organization that was colloquially known as the Black Bloc because their tactic was to organize, to dress in all black, to organize as a bloc so that it is difficult for them to be identified in order for them to commit violent and criminal acts without legal or police consequence. That began in the 1977 in Germany, but you have to go further back to understand the true, complete historical context of what this involves and what it entails. Really, you could go back to the 19th century, and you see particular groups that are idolized by some of those that are involved in the Antifa-related movements. And that is people like the Paris communes of the 1840s. That led to the label communist derives in large part from the Paris communes, who were able to use their control over the streets to effectively seize power over the city of Paris. Indeed, it was their success that led to the grand boulevards that we now see in Paris, as Napoleon III wanted to prevent and preclude such street theater, street violence, street protest from effectively seizing control over a city in the future. That's why their streets are so broad. Paris streets used to be very small and go into various back alleys. This allowed a protest group or radical group to seize control of the city. No longer possible in Paris. So you start from there. That's who they sort of idealize. There's a lot of romanticism of revolutionary and insurrectionary actions within the Antifa ideological impetus for its movement. Then you move forward to the 1920s. Well, you could also, to some degree, move to the late 19th century, the rise of violent anarchism as a actual functioning ideology, as anarchists believed that the state itself was the greatest threat and that the overthrow of the state in its entirety required violent action to achieve it and accomplish it. Thus, the famous Haymarket bombings in Chicago in the 1890s, and groups like the Molly Maguires, radical labor union groups, and the IWW, who believed that violence could be the Wobblies, could you be an effective tool of achieving a new economic workplace. The Molly Maguires went around bombing mines that had failed to unionize, and were part of popularly pictured in a film portrayed by Sean Connery, amongst others. So you had this sort of ideology that justified violence as a mean against the state or against corporate power as a means of achieving a political objective. That continued, and in particular using street theater and street protests and street riots and street fights as a critical means of achieving it. That manifested itself in the 19-teens and 1920s in the communists beginning to use street theater, taking strikes and just expanding them into violent theater in the local community or neighborhood not just targeting the business that is subject to the strike. Similarly, calling for general strikes, that the goal was to take down the edifice of the state, and using street violence and street intimidation tactics as a means of seizing power in the way they imagined and envisioned the Paris Commune did in the 1840s. That started happening throughout all of Western Europe. Of course, it succeeded in Russia in 1917, leading to the famous Russian Revolution and the first achievement of success of the Communist Party. But that continued to expand throughout the Western world, including in the United States and in Europe. That did not end it, however. That in turn precipitated the rise of fascism. Fascism, in large part, was built on a response to communism, not the other way around. Though if you read the Antifa narrative and their own origin story, their origin story is the fascists arose first, and they just arose to fight the fascists. But this is simply the political means and the political pretext to justify their violent course of conduct and violent actions, including premeditated, planned violence, which is one of the modus operandi of Antifa in particular. So they began in the 1920s. They're sort of rooted in 1920s, 1930s communist street violence. The fascists emerged in response to them. And ever since then, they've often needed a rallying enemy, a rallying adversary. So for them, the way they could unite the left and get political justification, political patronage for what they were doing, press patronage for what they were doing, politician patronage for what they are doing, they needed to say that what they're really doing is just fighting the fascist enemy, the fascist adversary. When in fact, what they want to do is through violence, bring about an anarchistic communist state or governmental operation that is as little as possible, though communist in principle, to take away the power of the police to protect the community or to enforce the government's edicts as they see it. That basically sort of emerged into the current form of the Black Bloc, finds its inspiration in a 1960s civil anti-war protest movement here in the United States. That was the Black Mask movement of the 1967 and 1968, where they wore black masks and did all kinds of sabotage and stunts to get attention on the streets, a form of street theater that was similar and comparable to what the Paris Commune and the communists and fascists tried to achieve in the 1920s and 1930s. He who won the street, owned the street, could own the city, could own the state. That was the mindset. That was the mentality that helped fuel it. But that did not end it, of course. Taking the ideas of the Black Mask, its ideas of street theater, its ideas of sabotage, and its utility as being a means of disguising any identifying information about you, such that you could not be identified by the public or the police if you were to engage in illicit or criminal actions, the Black Bloc, so-called, the Antifa group of Germany. In fact, Antifa derives its name from a group that the first part of their name was Antifa in Germany, is where this all originated in its current contemporary form. They started in the late 1970s, in 1977 and forward, and it's not a coincidence that their biggest day of celebration and use of violence is May Day. May Day was one of the most popular Labor Day holidays for the Communist Party. That's not a coincidence. They continued to march and the Black Bloc tactics and technique. And in fact, they started to be known as the Black Bloc, even though that's mostly a technique more than it is a particular ideology by necessity. They began be identified as the Black Bloc before they were identified as Antifa, and started to spread throughout Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and then the United States, the West, and the whole world. You can find Black Bloc protest in Asia. You can find Black Bloc protest in Latin America. You can find Black Bloc groups organizing in Mexico. So they began to use that common technique, that common tactic, sort of almost an ISIS method of organization, an Al-Qaeda method of organization, where you identify, where you have basically small cells that don't respond to any particular organized hierarchy in a conventional way. And the common techniques are you dress in black. Often you do black and red, reflecting the Red Brigades and others that from which they draw inspiration. In order to not be identified, in order to give yourself an intimidating aura. You train and tutor people in the techniques of rioting. You can go to YouTube videos and find Antifa guides about how to make rioting more effective, about how to convert a protest into a riot. That's the nature of their behavior and course of conduct. They learn how to use arson. They learn how to use property damage. They learn how to use physical assaults. They learn how to defend themselves against various police efforts to control or contain or cabin their conduct. They usually have medics with them who are ready and prepared to help try to defend and protect them or take care of them if they get injured or hurt. That's why in Berkeley, when there were protests and a person ended up getting injured, that was part of Antifa, there was immediate calls for a medic. It wasn't a call for a 911 medic. It was a call for the Antifa medic that is there on staff, ready to assist and help. They mostly draw their support from two different groups, from young lefties, much like the 1930s, much like the 1960s. The same dynamic is present. These are the sons and daughters of the privileged professional class. Most of them and many of them have degrees, college degrees, post-college degrees. These are would-be radical revolutionary grad students who have lots of pictures of Che at home. That's their mindset and mentality. They're disproportionately young, though they do have older members. What they believe is only by violently destroying the edifice of the state, the perception that the state can protect you, can they achieve their objective. Their political cover is that they're just there to stop the fascist and the racist from having control. They're there to defend protest against the racist and fascist. That is purely pretext. That has never really been their organizing principle. That is evidenced by their course of behavior. Their goal was to protect people from fascists. They would only show up at Klan rallies. If their goal was to protect people from abusive course of conduct, then they would be organized to provide security for civil rights activists in key parts of the country where it is controversial. You won't find them anywhere near there. Where you'll find them is in Portland, in Seattle, in LA, in New York, in Boston. You'll find them in urban, liberal, lefty cities where they function as a violent arm of the left. The way in which they, while they sort of manifested, their history goes way back, and they manifested in the 1970s in Europe, and then began in the 1990s and 2000s in protesting G7 and other events, making their first prominent appearance in the United States in 1999 in the protest of WTO, where there's been allegations that some of them were not necessarily even actual Black Bloc members, but were government saboteurs, undercover agents meant to undermine the protests there in Seattle. Whatever the course we may be, we don't know their full history. Some of them likely were the Black Bloc because they believe only violence against property and violence against people and violence against the police can achieve their objectives and aims to basically destroy the state in its current edifice and in its perception of justice. They take the movies like V for Vendetta as a script for a certain course of conduct rather than a calling cry, rather than an action to resist oppression. They see it as a means of overthrowing the state and the system itself. Thus, they target the property of corporations. Thus, they target police and other officials and people they see as their political adversaries. Thus, they engage in certain kinds of injuries and damage. They generally try to stay away from actual looting, theft, and that kind of action because that can track and trace back to them. They're not petty criminals of that kind. They are a politically motivated, politically animated class. Now, what led to their prominence in the United States in part was the Occupy movement of 2014. There were people on the left who saw the Tea Party as sort of an armed aspect of the right. They misinterpreted and misunderstood the Tea Party, but they saw it as basically the way that the right could activate its independent grassroots base to seize power on the streets. They saw them as equivalent to brown shirts in the 20s or 30s. That was an insane comparison, but it reflects what their mindset was. And it's why they greenlit the Occupy movement and helped support and subsidize it in various forms, organizationally, with media coverage, with academic justifications, and in some cases with actual participation involved in it. And that brought in Antifa as a much more powerful, potent group. Ultimately, Antifa undermined the Occupy movement by its routine acts of violence and assaults. Because one of the other problems with Antifa, aside from its ideology of anarchistic violence as a means of achieving their objectives, is that Antifa, in order to have people who are going to be effective at perpetuating violence, need to be like other movements, such as the Klan, such as certain communist and fascist street movements, the brown shirts and the rest, such as movements like even radical Islamic terrorism. Many of these movements will say that their participants, their most violent participants, will say that they're motivated by some ideology, but that's not really the case. If you just scratch a little bit beneath the surface, say, of the Ku Klux Klan, you'll find a bunch of people not so much motivated by race as being just pure old-fashioned sociopaths. These are people that will have criminal histories. They'll be violent towards their wives, violent towards their kids. They'll have a history of rape charges and other abuse charges, child pornography charges. These kind of things will percolate and pervade those kind of communities. What happens is these movements reach out to the sociopath and tell the sociopath, I'm going to give you a political pretext. I'm going to give you a moral excuse to act out your most violent and disgusting impulses. That's why these groups inevitably and inescapably end up with a disproportionate number of people who are simply dangerous criminals disguised as political activists. These are the ones who will do the most horrific and horrendous acts. And that is how Antifa sort of came to be. Now, the way it got to the power it has now, which I think shocked many people within the political establishment who had been dismissive of it and undermined the left, who decided that they could ride a tiger and the tiger has now decided to turn around and devour them, is because of what has happened since Trump's election. In that respect, that's about the media narrative. And the media narrative plays two roles here. One role is in promoting and protecting and propagating Antifa. The other is in pushing a fake narrative about race relations and civil rights in America in order to create the perception, particularly to the African-American community, that they should be in a state of permanent fear, that they should feel a permanent state of futility, that they should be constantly, continuously frustrated, that they should believe that white cops or random white people are out to cause them harm and will do so at any given moment or the drop of a hat, that it's because of an institutionalized belief system that can be only overthrown by some violent anarchistic action. This is the mindset that the media has pushed by deliberately choosing cases that are divisive to promote in the civil rights arena. Uniting cases, for example, where people of all races and ethnicities have been the victims of police abuse. There's about anywhere from 5 to 20% of any police force in the country that will have either trigger-happy people who cannot handle the escalation of confrontation that will result in a civil rights violation, or that are simply hardcore sociopaths themselves. Here again, ask yourself, who's going to go be a policeman? You're going to have a lot of people who are good, hardworking people who just want to defend their community and believe in enforcing the law. But also, if you're a sociopathic personality, where better to go than the police? If you go to the police, you get to exercise your violent instincts and impulses in the name of the law. You get to do it in the name of a badge. Inevitably, the very nature of police power is going to disproportionately invite people who have the most disturbed and dangerous mindsets amongst us. Now, we know there are ways to police this and to patrol this. We can screen it out through testing mechanisms. We can pay policemen a much more manageable salary, so it invites a wider range of participants so that the police force doesn't feel obligated to take every applicant. We can follow up whenever there's a complaint. Any bad police officer who engages in abusive conduct will almost always have a rap sheet and a record. Just like a criminal doesn't suddenly become a criminal at the age of 30, a bad cop doesn't suddenly become a bad cop 15 years on into the job. They have been a bad cop from the get-go, and they'll have shown it from the get-go, and there'll be a history of complaints and lawsuits concerning them in one way, shape, or form, just as is the case with the lead police officer in the Floyd case. He had a long history of problematic behavior, and you know who covered it up? The Democratic District Attorney, Amy Klobuchar, who's now, of course, United States Senator and would-be vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, Amy Klobuchar. That's something that the Democratic Party didn't want discussed, and now neatly won't be discussed much because the riots have taken hold of the political narrative instead. A case that could have been uniting, like the Floyd case, suddenly becomes divisive because of the riots. And there you must raise questions about what BLM's role and the media's role really is. In this context, we have groups like BLM constantly promoting bad cases. Cases like Trayvon Martin and the Zimmerman case, where it was Martin, not Zimmerman, pounding Zimmerman's head onto the ground, onto the concrete when he was ultimately shot in Zimmerman's self-defense, as the jury found. The media lied to you. BLM lied to you and told you that instead it was the other way around, that he was just a kid in a hoodie wanting to go out for some Skittles who was attacked by a random white guy wanting to harm any young would-be Obama son, to paraphrase Obama's rhetoric on the case. Mike Brown famously, hands up, don't shoot, except that never happened. He was just a bully going around bullying people in the neighborhood and community. decided to take over the middle of the street because he felt like it, decided to attack a policeman in his police car and try to seize his gun because he felt like it, and then decided to charge this policeman, a policeman 7 years on the job with zero history of complaints or problems, a critical sign that the case against him was bogus, leading to him self-defense. This is part of the media narrative. Why do they pursue these cases? There are plenty of cases of legitimate police abuse where African Americans have been the victims of violence and misconduct by police. Why not promote those cases? I do a lot of those cases. BLM is nowhere to be found. The media is nowhere to be found. Why is that? Because it's not called unite and conquer. It's called divide and conquer. We cannot, there have been various reports by some people of undercover actors, people with ulterior motives participating in these riots, instigating these riots, helping to create these riots. We cannot rule out that possibility because there's been a long and notorious history of both here within the United States and around the world of infiltration of domestic resistance movements to try to get them to act out in certain ways that actually become self-discrediting in the process, and again, justify more police presence. That's why we should be very hesitant to allow Antifa to get its reward by the president doing something reckless by sending in U.S. military outside of the National Guard. That is not intended to serve the president's interest. It's not intended to serve the country's interest. It's intended to solve a short-term problem by creating a much bigger long-term problem. And that is why we should be careful and cautious about it. But we cannot excuse the culpability of the system at some level at creating the dynamic for this to occur, whether it's the media doing puff pieces on Antifa and celebrating them as the tough guys who took on the racist at Charlottesville, that fake narrative, because you had the real narrative at Charlottesville where you had people who were wanting to protest originally for heritage purposes. Then that is co-opted by the alt-right and a bunch of racist-related groups who co-opt that for their own purposes. They could still barely get a couple of hundred people there max, despite all their organizing around the globe. Which gives you an idea for how small of an organization it is. Some of its organizers appear to have turned out to have been informants actually for the government. Others of its organizers had a political heritage that did not suggest their involvement in the alt-right and may have suggested ulterior motives or objectives. But either way, what happens is once they get there at Charlottesville, the correct history of Charlottesville, is that the police issue a stand-down order. The ACLU reported this at the time, as did I. So why did they do a stand-down order? Because Antifa needs the alt-right to be its moral justification. Communists needed fascists, and fascists needed communists to justify their street violence existence. And that's exactly what was going on, and that's why the media was building up the alt-right as this fictional, fabricated group that exaggerated influence and import, tried to project that the president himself was connected to them. This was all part of the plan and to justify Antifa's existence, to justify Antifa's pitch, to justify Antifa's promotion. What you will find is that without political patronage, without public patronage, without press patronage, organizations like the Klan disappear. Organizations like Antifa don't exist. They need support from key constituencies within the press, the political class, and the public to even exist and to propagate and have any meaningful impact. No less of a person than bin Laden recognized this, as his internal diaries exposed after his capture and execution, in which he himself explained within his notes his worry, his concern, his fear that if they didn't take certain actions, or if they did take certain actions in other cases, that either the omission or commission of an act could lead to a loss of public support. Which, what would that mean? Loss of recruits. What would that mean? Loss of safe harbors, loss of shelter. What would that mean? Loss of funds to operate. So in order for any of these groups to succeed, they need some degree of support within the press, within the public, within the political class. Antifa was getting that in droves, whereas the alt-right had basically none of that. The Antifa had tons of it. So in order to justify Antifa, they needed to exaggerate the risk of the alt-right. They needed to lie about the president and his supporters. The media did that en masse for years. Then when Charlottesville occurred, also what they needed to have happen is when Antifa stuck its head up in 2014, 2015 with Occupy, 2016 with the riots against Trump supporters during the campaign, then again after his election, then again after his inauguration, they needed to suppress knowledge of it or re-script it to make it look like effective protesting, taking down the evil fascist Trump, rather than the violent risk that they were of this anarchistic organization that supports left communism and violent causes and violence as its means to achieve power. In that same context, it worked, because not only did, in most of those cases, most of those people that assaulted people at the Trump rallies, almost none of them faced any consequence, and they got a lot of hagiographic coverage from the press. Then the same thing happened at the inauguration and after the election in 2016. The few people who were prosecuted in the District of Columbia were then given the same thing that Klansmen got in the early 1960s in Alabama. They got juries nullifying verdicts, doing jury nullification, acquitting people that were clearly guilty of committing criminal violence against a wide range of people and property, got to walk free in the District of Columbia, because the District of Columbia's jury pool looks like a 1962 Birmingham all-white jury pool judging a black man. It's To Kill a Mockingbird on steroids in the District of Columbia. But again, this partially was able to happen because the press had propagated Antifa from the get-go, exaggerated the alt-right from the get-go, and then did not cover these jury nullification disasters and scandals when they occurred. That led to Charlottesville. And in Charlottesville, they completely fabricated the course of events. They lied about the role of the heritage groups who originally were trying to create the protest, that it was co-opted by alt-right groups. They exaggerated the power and the role of the alt-right groups that were present. Then the police have a stand-down order. There's no National Guard present that could have been. The governor chose not to have them present. They tried to originally stop the protest, and then when it went forward, knowing that Antifa was coming to fight with the alt-right members there and the neo-Nazis and Klansmen, rather than increase the level of police presence, they decreased it. They issued, in fact, a stand-down order, according to the local ACLU at the time. What does that do? And then not only that, they had the police sort of force the groups into direct confrontation with each other. That led to the violence that broke out. The media pretended that that Antifa really wasn't Antifa, that it was just a group of honest, young college counter-protesters who had no interest in violence whatsoever, who suddenly were just violently assaulted out of the blue by alt-right. That was your Jake Tapper kind of fake news narrative that was spread. But it was, in fact, fake news. This was a violence between fascist groups and communist groups, just like the 1920s and 1930s, but in a new guise and new coloration. That's it. But rather than cover it that way, and when the president said it in those terms, good people on both sides, the heritage groups and the counter-protesters, and then the bad groups on both sides, the neo-Nazis, the alt-right, the Klan types with Antifa, he was blasted for it ruthlessly, repeatedly for the next 3 years, because the media had to write a hagiographic narrative that celebrated Antifa that day, and that's precisely what they did. They either tried to cover for it and hide for it, or mitigate or minimize the scope of the violence. They beat up reporters that day, or if they did commit violence, say, but it's in the honor of anti-fascism. Indeed, people like Chris Cuomo and others compared them to the veterans who freed Germany from Nazi Germany in World War II, who were disembarking from the boats at the beaches of Normandy. That's how ridiculous the coverage got in praise of Antifa. So what was the message? The message was join Antifa. The message was fund Antifa. The message was Antifa, do this again. And so they've been waiting for the opportunity to do so. Now, their core problem was the alt-right doesn't meaningfully exist in this country beside a few people at home in their mom's basement on the internet. So because of that, they had to wait and bide their time. They had to find the right place to strike. Now, they were testing in little cases, going after reporters and journalists like Andy Ngo in Portland, going after others, seeing what the media response was. And the media response, people like at BuzzFeed, pretended that Andy Ngo was the faker and that Antifa didn't really exist as a dangerous threat. That's the kind of lies that reporters at BuzzFeed and others were spreading around the world. And they tried that, of course, this time too, trying to pretend that either they don't exist or if they do exist, they're mostly doing a good service. This was the same way large members of the political right portrayed in the South, portrayed the Klan in the 50s and 60s. They either weren't that big, or if they were in existence, they weren't that bad. They were lying, and they needed political cover. That's what Antifa needs to function and operate effectively. So this hagiographic media coverage by the press helped bring about Antifa's strength to where they could do what they did this past weekend. Now, some of the members of the media were a little shocked because they forgot Sam Adams' rule. Sam Adams says, before you unleash the tiger of revolution, be sure you can carry it, but be sure you can ride it before it devours you. That's what they didn't recognize. Antifa is a truly committed group to violence as their means of political objectives and obtaining their power. They believe that they need to destroy the credibility of property, the credibility of police, the credibility of the state in order for their system to work. Protests are a natural breeding grounds to expand into making those protests and converting them and distorting them into riots. Then you invite the criminal class to join with you. The people who want to loot just for the sake of looting, arson, who want a little free stuff while they got the chance, and you have the perfect opportunity. The things that anarchy can open the door to, the criminal element as well as the non-criminal element, is what has always made it dangerous to the state and to the public. No doubt, that is the world in which we reside, and the question is why? Why was BLM so easily an accomplice, an aider, and abettor of Antifa's tactics and techniques in utilizing the cover and pretext of protest to be able to engage in mass looting, mass arson, mass assaults, mass burglary, mass criminal behavior, to try to attack and destabilize local police forces and the government? Well, that's because BLM is not a real civil rights group. BLM was created by someone whose master was literally in social justice. It was created by people who are not rooted in the civil rights community. For example, if you are rooted in the civil rights community, the most prominent and most successful organization in American history has been the Black Church. Now, the Black Church is predominantly Protestant, predominantly evangelical, predominantly culturally conservative, but they are rooted in their community going back centuries. They have real strength, real organizational power. Martin Luther King came out of the Black Church. That is how he was able to mobilize and motivate millions of Americans across the racial divide to unite behind civil rights calls and unite behind civil rights solutions. In the same context, even the Nation of Islam the Black Nation of Islam has equally recognized the same techniques and tactics as the Black Church, and that is why Malcolm X, while believing in arming yourself for self-defense, did not want violent protests to ever occur, and you won't find a violent protest that took place under the watch of Malcolm X. In the same, both of them were brilliant at organizing people politically, oriented towards civil rights solutions, not just rhetoric and language and political partisan power, but instead were their goals and their objectives were to have meaningful change. Both preached self-empowerment as a critical and essential component of that, the goal being to bring the communities together and to bring the Black community out of poverty, bring the Black community out of political disadvantage and disability and economic hardship that they suffered in the 1960s. By contrast, the Black Lives Matter group has no organization within the Black Church, doesn't come from the Black Church, doesn't participate or work with the Black Church in any meaningful manner in its organizational hierarchy. Indeed, the second group you would look for true civil rights solutions within an organic, authentic civil rights group driven by and directed by civil rights would be Black businesses. This would include restaurateurs, gym owners, other business people across the entire business spectrum, of which there are millions across the country. Construction company owners, distributors, truck drivers, you name it. People who have the means and the wherewithal, both financially and institutionally, to support organization to change things for civil rights. People who are also rooted in their local community, who know what the highlighted concerns are, who know the best approaches to take. There again, you will find none of these people involved in the hierarchy of the organization or orchestration or founding of the Black Lives Matter group. Third, you would look for policy analysts, civil rights lawyers who've been on the front lines, people like myself and others all across the country who've been doing civil rights suits for more than 20 years, people who have familiarity through those court cases, through those litigation, through the discovery that takes place in those cases, to know where are the problems, what are the solutions. Again, if your objective is let's have a more united country, let's have a less divisive country, let's have a country that solves its problems, that cures its defects, then that would be part of your objective. You would also bring in policy analysts. Many of those policy analysts share the left-wing objectives of BLM, but they're people that are familiar with where the problem really is versus where the problem really is not. They understand that racial animus does not motivate a lot of police abuse and misconduct. It involves police union contracts that cover for bad cops. It involves training mechanisms that fail to screen effectively for problematic police officers with personality disorders and sociopathic proclivities. It involves police and prosecutors covering up for misconduct and malfeasance in their office. It involves things like that. But that's the kind of institutional reform the BLM would pursue if they brought civil rights lawyers, policy analysts into the equation. There again, they're completely missing from the hierarchy of Black Lives Matters. You won't find the black church involved. You won't find black businesses involved. You won't find prominent civil rights lawyers or public policy analysts involved. That's because BLM isn't about civil rights. BLM doesn't care about civil rights. They chose the label, the title Black Lives Matter, as an inherently exclusionary title, meant to promote racial divisiveness as a political objective, to seek partisan power, not to seek meaningful uniting of the country, not to cure and heal the racial divides in the country, not to provide any policy solutions. That's why they excluded the black church from meaningful participation in its organization and orchestration. While they have achieved a lot of prominent success from big neoliberal foundations and major corporations, and you have to ask yourself, what's their objective involved in this process? People like Target and the rest happy to virtue signal their support. People like Airbnb sending out emails about how they're happy to virtue signal their support, but not take on meaningful institutional reform. As Dr. King said a long time ago, that would require a major restructuring of economic and political power. And that is something that they're not actually interested in fundamentally. They want virtue signaling for the perspective of a identity politics that continues to keep Black America as a politically dependent class within the Democratic Party apparatus, because the moment they achieve meaningful success, the moment they achieve equality, is the moment they lose their power base, is the moment they lose their pretext and excuse for obtaining and seizing power and prominence. That's why if you look at the biographical profiles of those who founded BLM, you won't find the black church in that history. You won't find black businesses in that history. You won't find organic civil rights support in that history. You won't find civil rights lawyers in that history. You won't find policy analysts in that history. And once you knew that, you could predict and forecast that they would be happy to join the Joker Jubilee in creating chaos and anarchy and violence across the United States, because they are happy to accommodate Antifa's objectives, because ideologically they share many of the same political perspectives. They are not seeking political reform. They are seeking their own form of political revolution, but a revolution that is not real and restructuring power, but instead inflames prejudices and inflames injustices continue. Come back after the break and we'll get into more as to how BLM is a fake civil rights group. Here's the kind of language you get on BLM's website to give you an idea that this is not so much a MLK-rooted organization, a Malcolm X-oriented institution. Most important, this co-founder explains, as a queer black woman, her leadership and work challenged the misconception that only cisgender black men encounter police and state violence. So this is someone who's not at all, this is someone rooted in identity politics of the academic left, not someone rooted in the civil rights community of the real world of African-American life. Opal Tometi is a third founder, a Nigerian-American writer, talks about how she's really good at creating social media strategies and online platforms, creating a national network, and uses the same language and rhetoric, talks about how she's heavily involved in immigration groups. Indeed, if you go to their action, you go to the BLM page, you'd think you'd find, okay, here's a bunch of civil rights cases that I should follow about exposing the problem. Nope, you won't find that. Oh, well, maybe I'll find a bunch of policy analysis from a wide range of civil rights lawyers and other analysts from across the ideological political spectrum talking about what the problem is and how we can solve it. Nope, won't find that. Maybe you'll find some historical context. What happened in the riots in Newark in 1967 and Detroit in 1967 that led to those communities being wiped out for 50 years. While some on the left celebrated those riots as revolutionary and insurrectionary acts that in turn led to black political power in those cities, what the rest of the world remembers is that for 50 years, the last place you wanted to move to was Newark and Detroit. Was anybody sitting around ever thinking, man, I can't wait to move to Newark. I can't wait to put my business into Detroit. These were towns and cities that were thriving working class communities for the better part of a half a century, until those riots helped devastate the political credibility of those towns as places to live in, work in, or set up shop in. And so those people who knew that historical context would know riots almost always backfire on the goals of civil rights and civil liberties. Yet you won't find any of that history on BLM's site. The supposed lead civil rights organization, according to the Van Joneses and the rest of the world, is an organization that is not rooted or steeped in civil rights at all. Not civil rights history, not civil rights organization, not civil rights success, not civil rights reform, none of it. And instead, in fact, if you go into many of their action points and what they've been active doing, it usually involves helping illegal immigration, which is disproportionately not a civil rights matter, or disproportionately helping various gay and transgender movements, also not a disproportionate black civil rights matter. So this is an organization that is not dedicated, not committed to meaningful institutional civil rights reform. That's why in fact, many of them are hostile to the black church. The leading organization for civil rights in the country has been the black church, but the so-called leading organization for civil rights today is hostile repeatedly to the black church as an institution and its individuals. They don't share its beliefs. In fact, they're adverse to its beliefs. This is why BLM is not a legitimate civil rights group rooted and steeped in civil rights history. It is a political group seeking identity politics as a means of solution and resolution, seeing various forms of political action as theater, seeing something that will go viral on social media, that go as something as art, something as performance art, something like a live Joker in real time. That is the origin of BLM and its organizers and its key founders. That's their mindset, that's their mentality, that's their history, that's their known expertise. So that is why they are happy to go hand in hand with the Antifas of the world to create the Joker Jubilee of performance art we've been witnessing over the past 4 days. When Vice interviewed many of the protest organizers, they said they had no problem with the expression of violence because that was necessary for the frustration and fear that they needed to get the world's attention. And the best way to do so was if some of these people were violent. But it's not just that. We have a historical precedent that can show that, in fact, you can do peaceable protest even in the most difficult context and the most difficult circumstances, because that's what both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X managed to do for the better part of a decade. Between them, they held hundreds of protests, often under the most difficult circumstances, with truly abusive police forces, not a few rogue police officers, but systemic abuse, with them wanting to unleash dogs and water hoses on people. And yet, despite all of that, both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X managed to keep their protest peaceable time and again, time and again. Now, that's because those protests were rooted in the religious communities of their respective neighborhoods and areas, rooted in the black businesses of their local areas. What that meant is anybody knew if they did anything wrong or wayward, they didn't have to worry about the police. They were going to have to worry about grandma at church. That's who they were going to have to worry about. They're going to have to worry about their own local community condemning them for what they did. And so consequently, they were able to keep strict control. That is why the fact that BLM is not rooted in the black church and in fact goes out of its way to be distant from it, is not rooted in the black business community, is in fact constantly critical of it. It does not have a lot of civil rights lawyers and policy analysts on its team because they don't want solutions. They want rhetoric. They want power that's achieved through divisiveness, that's achieved through fake news narratives where you have a problem that can't be solved. Why? Because the problem isn't a problem in the first place. That's why they exist. And it's BLM's complicity with Antifa that has let this occur. And they've brought in, invited effectively, they're either aiders and abettors or knowing accomplices at some level with these criminal gangs, these groups of criminals that are organizing under the guise of a peaceable protest to use that protest as cover to both infiltrate a community, to infiltrate certain locations, and then while the protest is taking place, hopefully distracting the police, they engage in criminality. It wouldn't be surprising if some of the looting and the arson was simply a distraction mechanism so that the criminal gangs could engage in the highest range of theft that has ever gone on in the history of this country in these forms of riots. We have not seen anything like this on this size and this scale ever in our history. We've had riots, but they've usually been limited to a particular community, to a particular incident, and did not involve mass-scale burglary of targeting of banks, targeting of other institutions, targeting high-end places. For example, look at what took place in Southern California. In Southern California, the rioting did not occur this time in Watts. It didn't occur in that neighborhood at all. This is the sign of gang organization being complicit in some of these activities, because there's parts of LA you can't go into if you're not a Blood or a Crip, if you're not part of the Rolling 60s or whatever other local gang is dominant there, depending on which neighborhood you happen to be in. They've been influential since the 1950s in Los Angeles. They predate the drug war. The drug war was just a means of conflict involving them and a means of monetizing their wherewithal and resources at the time. Notably, the violence hasn't taken place there. Almost no riots are occurring in Watts, which is historically where they've always occurred in LA. And so instead, They happen in Santa Monica. They happen in West Hollywood. They happen in parts of downtown LA. Why is that? Because they were using the protest as the cover to go branch off and commit criminality. One group goes off and commits various forms of small-scale looting, arson, breaking windows that draws the attention of the police, particularly the arson will. And then while that is occurring over there, and while they're having to manage this big group that the police can't figure out who's who because the rioters are infiltrating the police, the protest groups look like them, dress like them, behave like them until they break off and do their criminality. They're able to go off and commit all kinds of crimes under guise of a political pretext of a protest. That is what's taking place institutionally. You can see it live if you watch the recent Vice News coverage, even though they don't highlight it. They just mention, oh, look, there's somebody over there robbing Wells Fargo. They don't go into details about how coordinated this is. Instead, they highlight the police over-response, the police not being able to distinguish who's peaceable, who's not, who's part of a criminal group, who's not. And this is deliberate on the behalf of the criminal groups who, and at some level, the protest folks, now your ordinary protester doesn't know. They just got a social media message to come out and went out. But the people who are organizing at some level have to have a clue. They realize that this has been happening repeatedly, routinely all over the place, and they're doing nothing to prevent it. In fact, they're facilitating it by constantly doing protests late at night, past curfew time periods, taking over public streets that just happen to be easily mapped out so that you can not only commit Antifa-style politicized violence, but also mapped out so that you can commit selective forms of criminal robbery and theft, knowing that it leads to extraordinary frustration by the police, who are already underpaid and under attack across the country anyway for being institutionalized systemic racists. By the way, the data shows that white cops are less likely to shoot a black defendant than a white defendant because they're scared of this kind of political reaction. So the idea that systemic racism explains police misconduct when it doesn't, or that police misconduct is the kind of threat to an unarmed, innocent individual that other things are, is simply fake news. Indeed, it's useful to go back in that respect to the study, and I'm going to repeat this so people can look at it for themselves, the study by Roland Fryer. That's Professor Fryer at Harvard, who, by the way, not long after he did this study, all of a sudden he was subjected to internal attacks, like David Mamet's play Oleana-style attacks. All of a sudden, there were people complaining about whether he had abusive work conditions or sexual harassment or things like that. Probably just a coincidence he suddenly got attacked for that after he just put together an analysis he didn't think he was going to find. He believed in the myth. He thought, in fact, African Americans were being deliberately targeted by police like it was the 1950s all over again. Does that happen? There are instances where it definitely happens. It happens because there's some people who are racist. It happens because there's some police officers who see black defendants as less able to defend themselves in the court of law or the court of public opinion. That's in part. So there are examples and instances of racial discrimination, but by no means are they the systemic reason for any problem in the country. Indeed, that was his whole study. He went in thinking that police deliberately targeted African Americans, were killing them disproportionately in various confrontation contexts with unarmed individuals. And what he found was just the opposite. He found no evidence at all from a detailed empirical study of multiple police departments looking at multiple incidents across multiple cities, counties, and states and time periods. He found no evidence at all that there was any racially discriminatory motivation behind police killings. There was no systemic violation of African-American civil rights by police in the form of police confrontations leading to shootings. He did find examples of it in lesser forms of confrontation, lesser forms of violence, but not systemically about this whole myth that black lives don't matter because police just love to shoot them in the street. It's just a falsehood. And that's what the study, and it's an expansive study. It goes, let's see, the main core of the paper is over 40 papers. And by the way, he finishes it by saying black dignity matters. And his point is to make it broader scale to understand what's taking place with honest, objective data, not with misleading information. Indeed, the Wall Street Journal again reported what Heather McDonald has reported on, a professor and a scholar at the Manhattan Institute, called The Myth of Systemic Police Racism, going into detail how it just doesn't exist. Those who have looked at it as example after example, study after study. You remember Obama sent in his Department of Justice to politicize a bunch of police departments, put them under massive scale investigation. And guess what? Did you see any major civil rights suits coming out of those? No, you didn't. You didn't, because that isn't in fact what is occurring. That is not in fact what's taking place. And in fact, while you've had some people trying to continue to do peaceable protesting amongst this group, when they have faced these folks, they have tried to face them down, but have often suffered violent consequences from the behavior of the dangerous crowd. Let's take a look at clip number 13.
It's free reign. There's nobody at the checkout. But this nigga just pulled a gun out on not just me, but 5 other black females. And y'all sitting up here really pretending like y'all did this over Black Lives. A black man who looks like me, who should be out there protecting me, just pulled a gun out on me and 5 other sisters. So y'all tell me, keep lying to yourselves, talking about this is about Black Lives. Just pulled a gun out on me because I'm out here trying to clean up what's mine. Y'all so pro-black that y'all anti-black. Ain't nobody gonna say nothing about that, right? That's what I worry about. When the police came here, they ain't pull out no gun on me, but my brother did.
Indeed, but something tells me CNN and MSNBC aren't going to have her on anytime soon. Chris Hayes isn't going to be doing a front story feature of her. The New York Times isn't going to do a front page piece on her. The Washington Post isn't going to do a front page piece on her. She's only going to be heard in certain parts of social media. She will be shut out and suppressed from the institutional narrative that doesn't want to talk about that sees the police in that particular context as an ally and the local criminal as the adversary. That is something that the institutional press cannot afford to have spread. They must allow its viral disease to continue its infection across the American political bloodstream. Yet the leaders of these protests knew this would happen and did it anyway. They undermine their own cause and objective, which brings into question what their real motives are. But in the same context, more and more African Americans have spoke out against this behavior, against this dangerous, precarious behavior, against this disenfranchising behavior, against this disqualifying behavior of looting and rioting and arsoning and criminal behavior, often targeting the African community itself. Let's take a look at video clip number 2, where a storekeeper also scolds the various looters and riotous activists.
Problem that bothers me, you says Black Lives Matter. I work here part-time. Plus, I'm a part owner of this store. You said Black Lives Matter. Why don't you choke me? I'm black.
Tell him, sister.
Look what you did to my store.
Tell him, sister.
Look what you did to my store.
Tell him, sister. That's right, because I got they back. These are my dudes right here. Good
Look
men.
at the things you've done.
Good men.
Look.
The Black Lives Matter.
We've been here all night cleaning up. All night cleaning.
And you got black people standing right here with them. Black
Tell
people.
me
That's right.
Black Lives Matter.
Exactly.
You lied. You wanted to loot the store. You needed money. Get a job like I do. Stop stealing. This is the neighborhood. We're trying to build it up, and you tearing it down. What's your...
I'm sure Seth Rogen and the other Hollywood types will have her up for a GoFundMe real soon, just as they have for all the looters and the criminals and the gangs and the rioters and the arsonists and the assaulters, for the Antifa types and the fake BLM activists. Those they'll easily and quickly both fund the lawyers for. Many lawyers are offering pro bono services to that criminal class. In the same capacity, many of them will have offered GoFundMe accounts and massive donations in the millions of dollars, like Christy Teigen and others, to protect them. But what about her? What about the real Black lives that need to matter? Those are the ones being ignored by the fake BLM civil rights group that is not about civil rights or Black lives at all. Indeed, in that context, let's look at some of the news from today. Black Americans killed in the riots across American cities. This includes police officers. This includes a United States Marshal. This includes a coach. This includes somebody's father, somebody's brother, somebody's sister in another case, all because of the looting and the rioting that took place, inspired by the media's false narratives and propaganda about the risk to Black lives from institutional police.